listening to the Heartland Author Podcast. I am Aaron Apollo Camp. It's been a while since I produced an episode of this podcast, so welcome back. For today's episode, I had the opportunity to interview Connor Frost. Connor is not yet an author, but he is a songwriter, and among the topics discussed in this interview included, but were definitely not limited to, writer's block, which is something that affects every type of writer, whether it be an author, songwriter, or any other type of writer. I'm here with Connor Frost, who is a little bit different than most of our guests on the Heartland Author Podcast in that he's not an author, but he's a songwriter. Connor, welcome to the Heartland Author Podcast.
Thanks for having me, and what I will say is not an author yet. I will say that is definitely something that I plan on pursuing in the next few years, and I'm looking forward to it, and I really appreciate you having me, Aaron.
And I will ask a question about books that you might be writing in the future toward the end of the interview. But first, feel free to introduce yourself to our listeners.
Sure, my name is Connor. I am a musician, I'm a songwriter, and I'm a professional mentor who helps musicians to write and release their first album or single so they can effectively start their artist journey. So I've been doing the music thing for a long time. I'm a lifelong teacher as well. I used to work in middle school and high school as a teacher, and that's pretty much the summary of who I am.
Now, are you a songwriter, which is one that writes instrumental music, a lyricist who writes lyrics, or both?
Yeah, I would say I'm both. Lyrics obviously a big part of songwriting. But yeah, I would say sort of blanket songwriter. I would say I'm less of a producer. Production is definitely part of my songwriting process, especially as it relates to at-home production and being able to flesh out my ideas. But yeah, I would say first and foremost, I'm a songwriter. I do play instruments. I play guitar. I'm originally a trumpet player. Play a little bit of piano as well. So yeah, I would say just plain and simple, I'm a songwriter.
What are some songs that you've written?
There's a bunch. Right now, I'm working on a few new songs that I'm really excited about. Kind of going a different direction with what I've done in the past. But in terms of what's out there, what's been released, I've made music under my band Dizzy Bats for about 10 years now. Put out a record in early 2021, which hard to believe is almost 3 years ago now. There's 10 songs on that. On that record, wrote it over the course of a few years, and is a work that I'm really proud of. A couple songs on that album. There's one called Alone, which was our first single. There's another one called 5 Years, which was our second single off of that album. I believe in terms of what I've put out in the world, I think it's around 40 or so songs. I'd have to go into the archives and check, but there's a lot out there for sure.
Now, how do you approach your songwriting process? Do you have like a typical routine, or do you have a different approach?
So it really depends on the situation where I'm at, if I'm feeling some sense of writer's block or not, right? I would say typically I've always been someone who starts with some sort of chord progression on a guitar, right? That's my main instrument when it comes to songwriting and getting, more instrumental ideas out. And then in the past, from there, I'll build a melody off of that chord progression, and then typically I'll do lyrics last. But I will say, over the last few years, as I've done more songwriting mentoring, I've started to explore more, starting with lyrics first. And I find that when it comes to lyric writing, sometimes figuring out what to write about can be more challenging than actually writing. And so for my music, as well as clients that I help, I often say, let's start with an outline. Let's get really clear on what it is we want to write about. and the sections that come with it and what we want to include in those sections, and kind of go from there. So I would say it kind of depends, but in recent years, I've really been exploring starting with the words first.
Now, you mentioned writer's block moments ago, and that's something that is more commonly discussed regarding fiction authors and, to some extent, nonfiction authors rather than songwriters. But what is your best advice for a songwriter who is suffering from writer's block and wants to break free of it?
Absolutely. So if you are feeling that writer's block, I think it's first important to identify what might be causing it, right? Is it a lack of understanding? Is it a lack of motivation? Is it a lack of confidence? I think a lot of times it comes down to getting in our own way, our mindset kind of getting in our own way, whether that's self-doubt, whether that's perfectionism, right? So I think identifying, okay, what is the cause of this writer's block? And is it something that I can address here and now? That's the first thing. I think the second thing is to have different activities that are perhaps a little bit more passive, right? And what I mean by that is different exercises where you don't necessarily need to put pressure on yourself to say, you know what, I need to finish writing this verse, or I need to write a complete song over the next couple of days, right? I would think of different activities, whether it's journaling, whether it's listening to music analytically. I think that can be very helpful in terms of getting ideas and getting inspired, coming up with those more passive activities, so that you can always be learning and you can always be consuming, and when the time is right, hopefully be inspired to kind of break through that writer's block.
Now, what is your best advice to someone who is going into songwriting or writing lyrics for the first time?
Yeah, so I touched on it a little bit earlier. I would say getting clear on what it is you are looking to write about, and then creating some sort of outline which outlines what you are going to say in each section, right? So I'll give an example. So, maybe your main idea, whatever that might be, maybe you're going to include that in the chorus, right? Because the chorus is the section of the song where typically, with some exceptions, right, is where we express what the main idea of the song is, because that's what we want people to latch onto, and that's what we want people to literally sing along to, right? So that would be the first thing. Second thing would be to think about the verses, right? So in verse 1, what topics are you looking to touch on? What angles are you looking to approach them from? So maybe you're simply looking to set the scene, right? You want people to know what's going on around the character, right? You don't want to give too much away. So maybe you use verse 1 to set the scene. Maybe in verse 2, that's where you start to really progress what's happening, escalate the lyrics, progress the story. So maybe in verse 2, that's where you introduce another character, or maybe you introduce the conflict. And then in verse 3, or perhaps the bridge, if depending on the direction your song is going, that's maybe where you conclude the story and you kind of give the listener something to think about, after they're done listening to the song, right? So I think coming up with a clear outline can kind of eliminate that overwhelm if you're just getting started with writing, so that you have some sort of direction lyrically.
Now, I'm going to go back to a question I did not ask you a little bit earlier, but this will now fit more in later on in the interview. What is your online songwriting mentorship business called, and how does it work?
Yeah, it's funny. I haven't really fleshed out a complete name for it. I sort of do it all under just my name, Connor Frost Mentoring. And essentially, me and my team, we work with those who are looking to take that first step with their music. They're looking to turn their ideas into completed songs so that they can effectively start their artist journeys, right? So typically people who come in, they're looking to level up their songwriting. Maybe they have a bunch of ideas, whether they're lyrical, whether they're melodic or otherwise, but they're having trouble consistently finishing songs, and they really want to have a collection of original songs that they can call their own, so that they can take those next steps, right? And so, first and foremost, it's a songwriting mentorship, and it's a community. Right now there's a community of, I think it's about 25, at the time of recording this, I think there's about 25 songwriters inside the community. And so it's a really great place to get inspired, to be coached, to be mentored, so that you can consistently and confidently turn those ideas into completed songs, and you have a community of mentors and other songwriters to help you do that.
Now, I understand that you're a fellow podcaster. You host your own podcast. Is that correct?
That is correct. Yeah, I have a podcast that I started in April of 2022, so about a year ago. It's called Dear Songwriter, and yeah, I release episodes on a weekly basis.
Now, what type of content can be found on a typical episode of Dear Songwriter?
Absolutely. It's a good question. It's a little bit of a mix. I would say that's where most of my sort of, I guess I would call educational content would be as it relates to songwriting, giving you songwriting tips. I do a lot of song analysis where, I'll listen to a song and kind of break it down and make it so that you have tools that you can walk away with, that you can implement for your next song. And then on the other side of the thing, there's other side of the spectrum, there's a little bit of storytelling involved. I've gone on a lot of adventures through the many tours that I've done. So there's a lot of storytelling. Also, in doing so, giving you something to think about, giving you some value. And then the last thing I would say is just general sort of like mindset and goal setting tips, because I find that a lot of times it's not necessarily information that we need. A lot of times it's just encouragement and it's guidance. And so I like to include a little bit of a mix of everything. But first and foremost, I would say it's an educational podcast for those who are looking to level up their songwriting.
Now, do you know how to speak Chinese? And if so, what dialect or dialects of Chinese are you fluent in, and how did you learn to speak Chinese?
Yeah, so yes, I speak. That's funny. No one's asked me that on a podcast, so I appreciate that question very much. Yeah, I speak Mandarin. I speak Mandarin Chinese. I started learning in high school. I grew up around it. My mom is from Taiwan, and so I would hear her speaking with her friends and her family. But I didn't really start learning it until high school, and just really fell in love with it. Took some trips to Taiwan as a kid, and fell in love with Taiwan, and so it's been a big part of my identity and what I do, and just continued learning through college. I studied abroad in Beijing. And then after college, I went into teaching, and Mandarin and music were the two subjects that I taught for the couple years that I was a full-time teacher. And so I got to experience the other side of it, initially being a learner, still a learner, always a learner of all of this, but also getting to teach it, many moons ago, seemingly many moons ago now. But yeah, I was teaching Mandarin through beginning of 2022 before 100% making the transition into doing everything songwriting related.
Now, you mentioned this briefly at the very beginning of the interview, but you stated that you intend on writing books sometime in the future. Could you give us a little bit of a preview of what you are thinking about writing?
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure like many authors, or aspiring authors, I should say, I have many ideas. But I think, honestly, my first book is just going to kind of be a little bit of this, just a summary of what I believe you need as it relates to mindset tips, as it relates to resources, to write your first collection of songs, right? And that's typically who I serve in my community, in my mentoring. And so really just creating a book for that. Obviously, I've different title ideas, how to finally write your first collection of songs, right, is something that's come up to me. So yeah, that's an idea that I have. I also love the idea of writing a book that outlines some of the many adventures that I've had as a DIY musician, going on tours, kind of doing it all myself with some help, obviously, but kind of outlining that journey. I've definitely thought about that as well. But I think if I were to guess, I would say my first book is definitely going to be intended for, that person who wants to get started with songwriting and is maybe looking for a little bit of an outline and guidelines for how to get started.
Well, Connor, that was my final question. I thank you for appearing on the Heartland Author podcast, and you were a fantastic guest.
Thank you so much for having me. I really, really appreciate it.
Connor was a wonderful guest to interview, and if he decides to write a book in the future, I wish him well in that endeavor. This is Aaron Apollo Camp reminding y'all to write your imagination. Bye for now. You can learn more about me and my book writing projects at campaaronapollo.wixsite.com/authoraac. You can follow me on Twitter and Facebook at authoraac and on Instagram at aacscribe. Copyright 2023, Aaron Apollo Camp, all rights reserved. This podcast episode is intended for the private listening of our audience. Any reuse or retransmission of this podcast episode without the express written consent of the podcast host is prohibited, except under fair use guidelines. Royalty-free music and sound effects obtained from https://www.zapsplat.com.